I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound. At 22, George Washington helped ignite a conflict that became a global war. The new movie Young Washington calls it a single misstep. The real event was darker and far more complicated. Washington led a surprise attack on a French detachment. 5 weeks later, he surrendered to the dead officer's brother. Then, in the rain, he signed a French document describing the killing as an assassination. Washington could not read the word beneath his own name. So what happened in those woods, and did America's future first president unknowingly confess to murder? This was not the Washington on the dollar bill. In the spring of 1754, he was an ambitious Virginia militia officer with no experience commanding men in battle. Britain and France both claimed the Ohio River Valley, but neither controlled it completely. Native nations lived on the land, made their own alliances, and resisted both empires when it served their interests. At the forks of the Ohio modern Pittsburgh, the French had just seized an unfinished British post and replaced it with Fort Duquesne. Washington was marching toward it with only about 159 men, inadequate supplies, and the belief that reinforcements would eventually catch up. His written orders told him to act defensively, but they also authorized him, if anyone resisted British settlement, to take prisoners or kill and destroy the opposition. That ambiguity mattered. Britain and France were not formally at war, yet a 22-year-old officer had entered disputed territory with armed men and permission to decide when resistance had become an attack. Then word reached his camp that a French party was hiding nearby. The warning came through Tanacharison, a native leader the British called the Half-King. He was not Washington's subordinate. He was an ally pursuing his own strategy in a region where native communities were being squeezed by two expanding empires. On the stormy night of May 27, Washington took roughly 40 Virginians through miles of dark forest to meet Tenacharison's warriors. Men lost the trail. Several became separated. Near dawn, the combined party reached a rocky hollow where the French were camped below. Washington's men moved along one side. Tenacharison's warriors closed from the other. No reliable account tells us who fired first. The French said they had been surprised without warning. Washington said they reached for their weapons. What is certain is that the fight lasted only about 15 minutes. Washington lost one man. On the French side, roughly a dozen were dead, and 21 were taken prisoner. At first, it looked like a clean victory for the young commander. Then the shooting stopped, and the most important death occurred. Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, the French officer leading the party, was wounded or otherwise alive at the end of the exchange, according to accounts that emerged afterward. One version says he began reading a diplomatic summons. Another holds that the scene was less orderly and that the French wounded were attacked during the confusion. Tanacharison is widely identified as the man who killed Jumonville. But the surviving accounts disagree on precisely how it happened, and Washington's immediate report did not describe the dramatic execution later attached to the story. Washington had won his first fight. He had also lost control of what that fight would mean. If you enjoy discovering the history hidden behind the movies, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories, because the question now was no longer who won the skirmish. It was whether Washington had just attacked soldiers or murdered a diplomat. The French survivors insisted that Jumonville was carrying a summons ordering the British to leave French territory. In other words, they claimed he was performing the same kind of mission Washington himself had completed months earlier, when he traveled to a French fort carrying Virginia's demand that France withdraw. That comparison was devastating. Washington rejected it. If the French were diplomats, he asked, why had they remained concealed off the road? Why had they spent days near his position without openly approaching? To him, the papers were protection for a reconnaissance party caught spying on his camp. Both explanations served the interests of the people giving them. The French needed Jumonville to be an innocent envoy because an attack on a diplomatic messenger could be presented as an outrage committed in peacetime. Washington needed him to be a military scout because Washington had initiated the encounter before Britain and France had declared war. And Tanacharison had a third interest. His influence was being challenged, while other native communities in the Ohio country increasingly viewed French power as the safer counterweight to British settlement. A violent break between the empires could force native leaders to choose sides and make Tanacharison more valuable to the British. That does not prove why he killed Jumonville. It does prove that he was more than a supporting character in Washington's story. Days later, Washington wrote enthusiastically about hearing bullets whistle, calling something in the sound charming. King George II reportedly mocked the remark, saying the young Virginian would think differently after hearing more of them. Washington would not have to wait long. Jumonville's brother was already coming for him. Washington returned to a natural clearing called the Great Meadows and strengthened a small circular stockade, Fort Necessity. He initially believed the position was favorable. The meadow provided water and grass for animals, while open ground seemed to deny an attacker easy cover. Washington even claimed the fort was strong enough to resist 500 men, but that confidence depended on the enemy fighting the battle Washington expected. His force grew to roughly 400, including a South Carolina independent company under Captain James McKay, but promised support remained unreliable. Native allies refused to join Washington's planned advance against Fort Duquesne. Towner Harrison's group left the area after relations deteriorated and French retaliation became certain. Washington tried to move forward anyway. His exhausted troops cut a road through the wilderness, struggled to move supplies, and then learned that a much larger French force was approaching. Unable to reach a stronger position, they turned back to the fort they had never intended to defend as their final stand. The French commander was Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers-Jumonville's brother. On July 3rd, he arrived with approximately 600 French and Canadian troops and about 100 native allies. Rain had already begun falling. Washington formed his men outside the stockade, expecting a conventional fight in the open meadow. Instead, the French advanced, fired, and then dispersed into the tree line and the higher ground around the clearing. The same landscape Washington thought would expose the enemy now exposed his own men. For 8 hours, the French fired from behind trees, rocks, stumps, and brush. Washington's troops lay in trenches filling with water. Powder became wet. Muskets jammed. Livestock was killed. By evening, about a third of his force had been killed or wounded, and some men had broken into the rum supply. The French did not need to storm the stockade. They only needed to remain dry enough to keep shooting. At 8 that night, de Villiers called for negotiations. Washington was suspicious. His enemy was winning. Why offer terms at all? But with darkness closing in, weapons failing, and wounded men lying in flooded earth, refusing the offer could destroy what remained of his command. The brother of the dead French officer was about to give Washington a way out. The price was hidden in one word. Washington sent Jacob Van Bram, one of the few officers available who could speak French, to negotiate. Messages passed between the two sides for hours. Near midnight, Van Bram returned with the final terms. Imagine the conditions. The paper was handwritten in French. Rain had soaked and blurred it. The officers were trying to read by weak candlelight inside a crowded, defeated position. Washington did not know French. Van Bram's English was limited. Yet the offer sounded surprisingly generous. The British could leave with the honors of war. They could keep their baggage and weapons, though they would surrender most of their artillery. The French promised to protect them during the withdrawal. Washington's men only had to return the French prisoners, leave the territory, and promise not to build beyond the mountains for 1 year. Van Bram explained that the document also referred to the death or loss of Jumonville. Washington and McKay signed it, but the French text did not merely record a death. It stated that the French had come to avenge the assassination of an officer carrying a summons. Later, the document referred again to the prisoners taken at the time of Jumonville's assassination. The accusation appeared twice. On the morning of July 4th, Washington lowered the British flag and marched away from Fort Necessity. It was the only time in his military career that he surrendered directly to an enemy. Later, after a more accurate translation circulated, Washington understood the political meaning of what he had signed. He insisted that he and his officers had heard death or loss, never assassination. Van Bram was accused of incompetence and, for a time, even suspected of betrayal. But the signature was real. France now possessed more than its own account of Jumonville's death. It possessed a surrender agreement carrying George Washington's name beneath the French description of an assassination. That did not prove Washington had knowingly confessed. It did not resolve who fired first or exactly how Jumonville died. But in an imperial contest, a document did not need to settle the truth to become useful. It only needed to make one version of the truth easier to publish. The answer is yes, but not alone, and not with a single pull of a trigger. Britain and France had been competing for territory, trade, and native alliances long before Washington entered the Glen. Virginia's governor, Robert Dinwiddie, had financial as well as imperial interest in the Ohio country. French troops had already seized the forks. Armed collision was becoming increasingly likely. Washington did not create the powder keg, but his attack, Jumonville's death, fort necessity, and the signed accusation helped light the fuse. News of the defeat reached London. Britain planned a larger military response and sent General Edward Braddock with regular troops to take the French forts. When those plans became public, France moved reinforcements across the Atlantic. A local, undeclared struggle became harder for either empire to contain. By 1756, Britain and France were formally at war. Fighting spread across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. What Americans call the French and Indian War became part of the much larger 7 Years' War. A British observer later captured the chain reaction in one famous line. The volley fired by a young Virginian in the American back country had set the world on fire. The phrase is dramatic. The history behind it is even more revealing. The future founder of the United States entered the crisis as a loyal British officer trying to expand the territory of the British Empire. His victory lasted 15 minutes. His defeat lasted one rain-soaked day. The consequences outlived the empire he was serving. The film gets the essential contradiction right. Before Washington became a national monument, he was an inexperienced commander capable of courage, ambition, and serious mistakes. But a single misstep is cleaner than the truth. Jumonville Glen was not simply one young man making one bad decision. Dinwiddie issued the mission. Britain and France made overlapping claims. Land companies and imperial officials wanted access to the Ohio country. Native leaders acted for their own nations and communities, not as extras in a British story. Harrison helped create the confrontation, then broke with Washington before the French retaliation. The film also presents Washington's relationship with Native allies more smoothly than surviving account support. Their alliance was political, fragile, and shaped by mutual distrust. Most importantly, the surrender papers should not be treated as a clear confession. Washington signed it. The French used it. But his later denial is consistent with the conditions of the negotiation: darkness, rain, damaged handwriting, no independent translation, and a translator struggling between French and English. The honest historical answer is uncomfortable for both sides. The French description of assassination cannot simply be dismissed. Washington's signature cannot simply be read as an admission of intent. And the killing itself remains trapped between conflicting accounts written by men who immediately understood that the story could help decide who would be blamed for a war. George Washington walked out of Fort Necessity on July 4th as a defeated British officer. 9 years later, the war he had helped ignite ended with Britain dominant in North America, but buried in debt. London tried to make the colonies help pay for the victory and restricted settlement beyond the mountains. Those decisions fed the anger that became the American Revolution. So the deepest irony is not that Washington lost his first campaign. It is that, while fighting for the British crown, he helped begin a war whose aftermath pushed the colonies away from Britain and toward the nation he would one day lead. Before George Washington became the father of his country, he helped set in motion the conflict that made that country possible. History remembers the victories. We uncover the stories that made them possible. Subscribe to Forgotten War Stories